You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
So let's get to your question then, because I did I asked you about that, which is, can you discuss your journey from being a monetary theorist, a monetary historian, and macroeconomist? You wrote 2 really good books. And then the next thing you know, you're writing a book on Hayek and the family. At some level, it seems like a disjoint, but what is it that unites that experience? How did your teaching impact that experience?
Well, that's the answer. The answer is the role of my teaching affected that. So we'll back up because I think that, what unite, the first book was the dissertation revision. Okay, we're going to just put, it's good. And I read it now and I'm still proud of it. I would have done some things differently, but okay, put it aside. Cause the other 2 matter more. And of course the new little book from Cato too, but the 2 other books matter more. The macro book, grew out of my teaching, right? I was teaching money and banking for many years at St. Lawrence. And I designed the course sort of how would I present this? And as I taught the course through the years, you have to think about how you're going to convey those ideas to students and what pieces and what's on the reading list and all these sorts of things. And I taught some intermediate macro in there too. And sort of in conversation with students, you begin to see where the problems are, and you begin to see connections, and you begin to come up with a story in your head about how these all fit together. And so I very much, and I think imitating Buchanan, right? The things I was doing in that class were test driving the ideas that were in the book. And there were times when students asked questions. There's a whole little thing in the chapter on deflation about we talk about inflation and forced savings, right? Is there forced investment during deflation? Well, yeah, there is. Inventories build up. And that whole argument came out of, a student asked me in class one time, said, well, wait a second. If they're parallel the way you're talking about, is there such a thing as forced investment and deflation? I'm standing in front of the class going, well, yeah. And sort of thinking it through on my feet. And so I think that book came out of my teaching in an important way. Obviously the sort of depth and sophistication of the ideas in the book were not things I was going to do in an undergraduate money and banking class, but having to convey the basics of it in a classroom to 20-year-olds, right? That's how you build your story. So it really did come from that. And at the time, right, I was writing on those issues in a whole bunch of ways.
Can I ask you a follow-up question on that? Because the story you told about the picture where you were basically probably a junior in college and you were on a family trip and you're reading Kerzner's competition entrepreneurship. So you'd probably had intermediate micro already, but you probably didn't have an advanced elective, and it's like right in that sweet spot.
Yeah, it's right. Yep.
Your macro book, which by the way I think is just wonderful. So, and you have a very sophisticated article that's in Journal of History of Economic Thought and Methodology, which lays out a lot of the theoretical ideas on that, which would, just what you were saying, probably beyond the grasp of most undergraduates at some level. You'd have to be a graduate student, I think, to be into that. Yeah. But your book is not like Garrison's in the sense that it's a pure pedagogical exercise, right. But yet it also does fit right after someone would have had intermediate macro and money and banking, but before they go get advanced macro.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because that was my intent. My intent was that students who've had intermediate macro and money and banking ought to be able to read this book profitably. They might not get it all, but they ought to be able to read it and understand it and find, in that spot, like you say, before the advanced macro or before grad school, right? I think my sense is a lot of the Mercatus PhD students end up reading it sort of in their first year if they haven't read it already.
Sure.
Something happens that leads them to read it, right? And that's another great sweet spot for it. I can, if I was taking a fairly standard macro 1 and macro 2 in grad school and reading me and Garrison alongside it, right? That's what you'd want to do.
I think
so, yeah.
But you're hearing it first. You did for macroeconomics what Kerzner did for microeconomics.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you, first of all. And secondly, what Kerzner said, right? Kerzner said that my book and Rogers were the two most important books written in Austrian economics since the 1970s. He said that in about 2000, right? Shortly after they were published, right? Yeah. And so now I get independent verification of that from. Thank you. That's a very high compliment, and it's I didn't set out to that sort of goal specifically, but because probably I thought that might have been reaching a little too far.
It fits that mold, and it's
no, that's right.
And also, as you know, and again, it fits the idea that there's a unified economics. Yeah. There is no micro and macro.
That's right.
Micro applied to macro questions, and so the coordination theme is throughout. So we don't. But you did great with that. So now to the family. How the hell do you go from macroeconomics and monetary history to discussing the family?
So I think there's two things happening there. The most important thing is, again, it was teaching. So I'll make the long story short. I taught for a long time in the first year program at St. Lawrence, eventually became associate dean. And the first round I taught with a psychologist colleague and some other people, and we did nothing that was really related to my interests, although we did read Darwin every year, and teaching Darwin was an interesting thing and helpful. But when I went back into the program after I got tenure in 1996, I didn't have a team to work with. I said, look, I want to come back and teach, but I don't have anybody to work with. And the associate dean at the time paired me with two junior colleagues from other departments, sociologists and psychologists, both women. And it turned out that we started talking, and they both had an interest in doing stuff, research on the family. Okay, so I'm a tenured person working with these two younger colleagues, junior colleagues, and I'm like, all right, what am I going to do? I'm not going to force my research agenda on them. Let's teach something that works for them as part of their research that they can easily get into and perhaps would be, fertile for their research. So, all right, let's figure out what we can do in the family. And in part back of my mind going, Gary Becker, right? I can do this, right? You don't have to be a genius to teach freshmen about sort of thing about the economics of the family. Well, I worked with those folks for a couple years, and then in 1998, whatever it was, I started teaching with different psychologists. My friend Kathy Crosby, who was beginning of a teaching and intellectual partnership and deep friendship that continues to this day, and one of the first things Kathy said to me when she kind of came in and we were thinking about the course was, it was 2 semesters. And she said, the second semester, we focused more on policy. And she looked at me and says, you know what we should read? And I'm like, what? We should read John Stuart Mill on Liberty as a way to get them to think about the relationship between the individual and the state. I just met this person, right? I'm like, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. And she also, by the way, Kathy has a background in the law and sort of new family law and parental rights stuff. And so the course we put together was just great. And by that time I'd done a couple of years, and so I knew some things, and I kind of knew what I wanted to do. And as you're putting this together and you're working with people from other disciplines and you're trying to communicate this to 18-year-olds, I'm sitting, even like when Kathy or the other folks were talking, I'm sitting in the back going, how would Hayek talk? I mean, that was really back in my head was, how would Hayek or how would Hayekians talk about this? No one talks about the family as an institution. I mean, even in Hayek, you could go through all the pages of Hayek, even his note cards and all that stuff, and count on 2 hands, maybe one, the times he talks about it. And it's always a kind of off the cuff. Oh, they're important. Families are important. All right. So obviously there's a market niche here, right? I have an entrepreneurial opportunity, but I had to have a story. And I think the key to that whole book, frankly, is the 2 sorts of worlds at once idea, right? How do families bridge that micro order and the macro order of the Great Society? And so I just became intellectually entranced with trying to sort that stuff out. So that's the big piece of it. The smaller piece of it is well, maybe two smaller pieces. One smaller piece is I was also at that time starting to do this stuff on the economic history stuff on standard of living and all this, how much life has improved and sort of, again, Julian Simon's part of that, but the work that Don Boudreaux was doing and Mark Perry at AI. So all these people were, and the Cox and Allen book was tremendously important for me in that, A Myths of Rich and Poor. So life's great, right? And so how do we sort of mix in that, and as you know, right, it goes back a long way, but I'm the libertarian feminist from way back when. And so there was that piece of it too, which was, and go back to our earlier conversation, this was a left libertarian project also. How do we talk about families and gender in ways that are a voice of the left, but a different one. So all those things I think came together. Plus, frankly, I was a parent of, at the time, young children and then teenagers, and so thinking through my own parenting experiences were important too.
It's an important thing, is raising kids with all.
Well, that's right. And so how you fall in love intellectually with something, and you go, all right, now I got to write it. Okay, I have these ideas. I've been thinking about it. It's fascinating. No one's done this before. I got to write it, and I got to say, I'm really, really proud of that book. Here's what I'll say about the two books. The macro book will be read in 100 years. People will still be reading the macro book. They will. I don't know if they'll still be reading the family book. I hope so. But that book, the family book, was just like fun and new and different. And I think part of the challenge for us who are in this academic thing for the long haul is, how do we keep ourselves entranced in that way? How do we keep ourselves invested in and curious and exploring new things? I know that you have got a later question about what makes me curious these days, and I have a cute answer for you when we get to that. But I think that's the key. And your question suggests it, which is you always have to reinvent yourself, right? You have to reinvent yourself in one way or another. And that was a moment of reinvention. The interesting and ironic thing about it is that I started writing that book in 2000, really the actual writing of it in 2007. I was 10 weeks at Bowling Green after I finished as associate dean. I started the writing. Well, what happens? The financial crisis breaks, and blogging is happening. And that's about the time I started blogging at Now Coordination Problem, and well before Bleeding Heart Libertarians. But and Routledge reissues the macro book in early 2009, and suddenly I'm thrust back into that stuff again as a public intellectual, right? And I'm having the time of my life, right? As a public, I'm on the Judge's Show, right? It's great, and I wouldn't have traded that for anything. But two interesting consequences to that. One, it made me put the family book on hold. The family book should have been published 5 years before it was, but I had to put it on hold because I had to, right? I mean, I was compelled to speak publicly about what was happening. My open letter to my friends on the left, right? Fall 2008, right? All this stuff. The other interesting thing about that in my own career is we were looking for a new dean at St. Lawrence at the time. And the president would have loved to have had me as the dean and VPAA right around this time. But I sat in his office and I said, look, Dan, two things. One, I haven't had a sabbatical in 10, 12 years, whatever it was. It was a long time. I said, secondly, you're not going to, you can't give me anything that's going to take away from all the fun that I'm having. This is what I do. This is what I love to do. And I will find other ways to serve St. Lawrence, but now is not the time for me to do this. So there's a couple interesting what ifs there, right? About the future, but I can't, no regrets, right? So the family book ended up taking more time than I thought because, and the other interesting irony of the family book is I got the page proofs. This is true. I got the page proofs the day the Obergefell same-sex marriage decision was decided when that came out.
Timing, right?
Yeah, and that was beautiful. It was beautiful. Well, it didn't. What was cool is that I was able to rewrite a couple things real quickly, right, to account for that. Because if the timing had been different, I would have been stuck with some stuff that looked outdated. But I will note, by the way, I called it correctly about what that decision would be and why. So.
I would.
Who says Austrians can't predict?
It's interesting the financial crisis impact, and the role that we played. You and I, we wrote this little monograph on that. But, in both of us in our own way, we got drawn into having to make commentary about what was going on. People wanted to, in various ways, write articles, give talks, whatever. And one of the consequences for you is that you didn't become a dean, and that would have sent your career in a different path. The issue for me was that I actually stopped coaching. And, the year before, I got inducted into a local, Hall of Fame here for my coaching career, and I had to stop coaching. And I only coached one other year 2 years after the financial crisis hit. And then I had I've had a lot of offers to go back, and every single time it was like, not now obviously, but in those first couple of years, and I was like at other schools and other places and everything, I was like, no, I can't do that. I'm focused too much on this. I can't do that. And it sort of changed, my trajectory about things as well. I mean, if I would have kept coaching, there's no way we could have had the Hayek Center or anything like that.
Right. Well, let me add one more piece to this that's relevant to Mercatus specifically. It just struck me too that 2005 is Katrina, and my work on the Katrina project was another, in terms of my public intellectual life and my sort of there's a whole group of people who only know me as the strawberry Pop-Tarts guy, right? that my stuff on Walmart and Katrina got. I mean, and the double irony is I was supposed to be on Stossel, if you remember, to talk about this stuff. Why did I get bumped from Stossel? Because the show aired the day that the stock market tanked, and Stossel bumped me to talk about the financial crisis. Irony of ironies, right? So that the Katrina stuff was really important too.
That was a very rewarding and important project, I think.
Yes. For all of us, I think we're involved. Yeah.
Yeah.
And a template, by the way. I don't know what you guys are going to do with the pandemic, but it's a template.
But again, going back to the earlier point, if you think about it, look at the book that Virgil and Emily and Nona put together. Again, that's a social history.
That's a Lavoie book through and through.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. I wanted to ask you about basically your relationship with Mercatus, but also I have this description in here, and I'll try to be very brief because I've taken too much of your time. But
I got time. This is so much fun.
So when we started our program at Center for Study of Market Processes, there was a kind of a like you said, a thing that Rich Fink wanted to get, and then Don and Jack and others inherited it from that. And that was that there was a commitment to recruit and train graduate students to become what I call 5-tool players. This is my love affair with baseball, the idea of a 5-tool player. But anyway, it was first and foremost, and we were taught this from day one, that we had to communicate to our scientific peers, not our friends in the Austrian world, but the scientific peers in the broader community.
The expectation of having something at least forthcoming in a non-Austrian journal when you got out the door.
A referee journal and the ability to get tenure and all that kind of stuff like that. We were supposed to be effective and inspiring teachers in the classroom that had our own syllabuses and develop that. We were encouraged to try to learn how to be persuasive public intellectuals that could write op-eds, that could give public lectures, that kind of stuff. So written and spoken world. And we were supposed to be able to, if given a public policy issue, that of pressing demand, could be able to critically analyze it and whatnot. And then finally, because there was no extensive network, as you talked about, we were supposed to be the builders of a network that would then benefit the generation behind us. This is the version of the play it forward kind of thing.
Right, that's right.
And so you had to be a clever and creative academic entrepreneur, someone who would be willing to be a department chairman, be willing to be a DGS, be willing to build a new center. And so first, do you see yourself in that training? And do you feel the same kind of way about the the way we were taught and the expectation we were taught with. And, how do you see that as, not everyone can be a five tool player, and not all 3-tool players or even 2-tool players are bad,
right?
To have on your team.
That's right.
But this goal of trying to create these 5-tool players, and especially in the world that we're now about to face. So the world that you and I faced and the world we're now about to face because of the implications for higher ed caused by the pandemic. What weight do you put on having the 5 tools as opposed to just 1 or 2 of the
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And as as I read that list, I was thinking 5 is the 5th one is interesting because also administrative, not just entrepreneurial ability to build a new center institution, but also to be a department chair, to be an associate dean or a dean or whatever. Those tools are important to me. You're right. That's right. Yeah, and
editor of journal.
Yeah, right.
All these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is important to try to cultivate people who have as many of those tools as possible. I think one of the ways in which, if you look back at our successful younger colleagues and us too, one of the ways we were able to get our feet in the door was because we were outstanding teachers. And I think that we should never underestimate the importance of that. And I think there's interesting reasons why Austrians tend to be outstanding teachers. And the reason is that we're used to communicating our ideas in ways, go back to my book, in ways that undergraduates can also understand. And so even our scientific ideas, right, are this is the advantage of being a largely verbal community.
Steve, you used to put that in an empirical testable form. If you were Tellison, you could have done. You used to say that students of Lavoie have won more teaching awards at a variety of universities than other mentees. Have you ever gone and done the empirical?
No, I haven't, but it's interesting. It would be interesting to do that now. Yeah. So so that tool is really important, and it's an important tool for overcoming what still is a kind of suspicious eye about Austrians and GMU and all that. If you're a really good teacher, that's how I got the job at St. Lawrence, right? It was clear I was a really good teacher, right? And okay, we'll put up with the rest. And it was also clear I was going to publish. So I think that's the most important. But if you can do the public intellectual stuff and learning how to, and an important part about that is learning how to deal with media and being willing to do that kind of stuff. One of the most important things that I try to tell young folks is, look, don't shy away from a media opportunity because you don't think you're an expert on that thing. You don't have to be an expert. Right? All you got to have is Econ 101 and just be able to communicate it, right? I'm doing this stuff now every year. The media people at Ball State take these reports about consumer spending at the holidays, at Halloween, and then the Christmas and Hanukkah, and then Valentine's Day. National Retail Federation says we're going to spend X billion dollars on these holidays, right? He sends me the numbers. I write up a little thing where I say, here's why, right? Here's why this year. I said, well, Halloween's going to be different this year because of pandemic and electoral uncertainty and blah, blah, blah. He sends it out. I wind up getting all these media hits from it, right? I got a local TV interview on this stuff. What am I an expert on? I'm not an expert in this stuff, but I'm a good economist, right?
You called your dad and asked him how many ads he was clipping.
Right. So, don't shy away from this stuff and get some training. I mean, I had theater experience and all this. And so I was comfortable in those ways. If you're not, get some training. Almost every university will do it for you if find a way to train you, and get comfortable in front of a camera or on
I forgot about that. You do have theater training just like Munger does.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why you guys are so comfortable.
Right. And also
like I'm a deer caught in headlights. I'm like,
right. And better than the two of us is Aunt Davies. Aunt Davies is deeply trained in theater, right? And so, Aunt's one of the most effective communicators of our ideas that out there in many ways, precisely because he has that kind of comfort and training in front of a camera on a stage. Is great. So yeah, I think just getting comfortable with it and not being afraid to make a mistake. But universities value that stuff immensely. I mean, my 5 minutes on CNN a few years ago was worth $500,000 to my university. Think of it that way, right? What would they have to pay to get 5 minutes of advertising on CNN? that's the value you deliver when you do that. So, so that stuff's really important. And, you know, if you have the patience and the skill to be an administrator, you should do that. You know, for me now, I'm building I got some money. I got a center. I got to figure out what to do with it, which is complicated by the pandemic and my own health situation. But, you know, all right, let's move forward with that. So I also think that that's part of never being bored with my job. I don't, you know, I'm going to say this. My current department chair doesn't want to hear me say this, but I'm like, look, writing articles for referee. I'm 56, right? And I'm doing different stuff. Writing articles for referee journals without grad students, right, isn't where I get my yayas now, right? I mean, if I had grad students, it'd be different, right? Because I have to in some sense, but I also have that, be in that conversation ways. There's just other things that excite me that I want to be able to do. I mean, I have to do the first for, you know, accreditation reasons and so on, but it's not where I get my excitement from, and that's okay. But that's fine. For a while, I got my excitement from being an associate dean. Okay, that was fun and a challenge. So I think staying challenged and staying curious.
By the way, I should congratulate you. You recently won the Julian Simon Award, and also before that, you also won some other award for liberty and advancing economic education overseas. So congratulations on those richly deserved awards. The Julian Simon Award seemed to be one that you particularly cherished. Could you talk a little bit about it, your experience in getting it, and whatnot?
Well, so the story's kind of funny. Kent Lastman, the head of CEI, who's just awesome, by the way. Hi, Kent. Kent sent me an email and said, that's back in like February, sent me an email and said, do you have a few minutes to talk this week? There's something I'd like to talk over with you. And I'm thinking, let's see, are they working on it? Because I knew like Ian Murray and other people were working on this stuff on standard of living. Maybe there's a paper he wants me to read. I'm thinking, what the hell is this? So I kind of ignored it for like a day, right? I'm like, okay, I'll call him back. He said, call me later in the week. All right, I'll call you later in the week. I ignored it for a day. I come home one day and Sarah says to me, did Kent Lastman get a hold of you? I'm like, what? And she says, well, he called me trying to get a hold of you, and he was worried maybe you were in the hospital or something because you didn't return his call. I'm like, he said call later in the week. What the, you know? So I called him, sitting right where I'm sitting right now. I called him the next day, and he told me. And you know, I'm going to do it now, but I got off the phone, and I lost it, right? And that.
Congratulations, by
thank
the way.
you.
Yeah,
that award means a lot to me because of what Julian wrote about. You know, you're asking me about why I'm a joyful warrior, and I want to come back to that whole set of questions. I don't want to forget that. But part of it is that was Julian, right? The guy was a happy warrior, which is ironic because he suffered from depression his whole life. And there's a great video that you can find on YouTube of him speaking. I think it's at Cato, I think, in the auditorium, and he's wearing a pair of devil horns on the top of his head. It's like, yes, we should all have that much fun with what we're doing. And so Julian, you know, and then when you look at the substance of what Julian had to say, from this sort of vision of humans as the ultimate resource and of progress and the upward march of humanity and all that stuff, that has been, you know, for me, that going back to where we were talking about the family book and how that is in the family book in certain sorts of ways. But that to me now that's where my part of where my intellectual curiosity is sort of pushing that out. And the other part about the Simon Award, you know, I looked at that list of previous winners. you know me. I'm not shy about my own ego and about, you know, my own self-evaluation is, I never underestimate myself. But I looked at that list of previous award winners. I'm like, whoa, wait a second now. You know, my friends, Vernon and Deidre, even Pierre, whose work I think is amazing. And then people like Lomborg and all this. And then I looked down, and then they didn't give the Simon Award here because they gave a special, like, super duper Simon Award to Norman Borlaug. I'm thinking to myself, how did I get on the same freaking list as this guy? This guy's responsible for billions of people living, right? Yeah. What the hell did I do, right? And so that's, to me, that's still the most sort of overwhelming part of this is sort of, am I, you know, how did I get to be that guy? And you know, maybe I am, but but maybe this helps persuade me that I am. But it's still, I still can't. That's like a giant thing to swallow that I can't quite yet swallow. So the Greek award and my friends over there gave us, we had the time of our lives. We were over there for a week. They treated us like royalty. It was incredible. And I treasure that award because that award was a kind of economic communication award. Right. And that's really important to me.
I'm, as you know, I'm not very good at pithiness. Right. One of the things when we first started doing coordination.
Yeah. And by the way, every pithy thing you've ever said, you stole from me. That's the other part.
I'm going to steal one from Matt Ridley and ask you to comment on it now. Yeah. But I remember when I started Coordination Problem, I wrote to Tyler and I said, hey, I don't really understand this medium because I basically am writing like short journal articles with footnotes and everything and, whatever. And he writes back and he says, just in typical Tyler terms, he goes, there's returns to pithiness. And I wrote back and I said, I don't understand. And he wrote back, I know. That was a great line. But recently, Matt Ridley has this phrase, which relates to the kind of Simon-esque kind of position, which is innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity.
Yeah.
Comment.
Yeah. Yeah. So read it one more time. It's the
innovation is the child
of freedom. Yeah.
And the
that's right.
parent of prosperity.
That's right. And so I love the word innovation because I think that word is important. And I want to when I teach this stuff, like in comparative or American economic history, I want to distinguish innovation from invention.
Right.
There's lots of inventions, but innovations are the parent of prosperity. That's exactly right. Which is the innovations are the inventions that make us better off. And how do you turn inventions into innovations? And better yet, a very Boettkean question: how do you know which inventions will make good innovations? Yeah. That's where the freedom piece comes in, and that's where you need markets. You need the institutions of the marketplace, and frankly, liberalism more broadly, to give people the freedom to experiment. I love the idea of permissionless innovation. I would say invention because you don't know, right? It's the permission is about the invention. It's the market that makes it an innovation. Right. But the idea is the same idea. That and Deirdre's market tested betterment and whatever she's calling it these days, right? I mean, all of this stuff, right, is about the same thing, and it's all Simon-esque. It's all very much in
all roots in Simon's.
Yeah, and so I don't know if you saw it, but I posted about a 2,000 word piece for me when we did the awards ceremony thing online, and I did two things in there. One, I criticized two of my heroes in there, Julian and then Hans Rosling, right? And which it was criticizing Rosling was kind of fun because, by the way, if he was still alive, he deserves that award too. Sure. I can link him a whole list. But anyway, and I said about Julian, I said, Julian didn't emphasize enough sometimes the importance of liberal institutions. It was too easy to walk away from Julian sometime saying, oh, population growth is good. Well, if the institutions are right, it's good. Right. If it's not, it's a nightmare, right? So that point, and the point that we were just talking about, right, which is, yeah, ultimate resource, but if you're not free to deploy it and don't have a feedback mechanism to know if you deployed it well, right? And that second point, by the way, is also somewhat underplayed in Simon. Yeah. And my criticism of Rosling, by the way, is in the washing machine video, which, I adore and I show like in every class. It's just brilliant. At the end, right? At one point he says, if you give people democracy, they'll vote for washing machines. Now, washing machines don't come from democracy, Hans, right? And you don't vote for them, not in the way you mean, right? And then at the very end, the end is great where he says, thank you, industrialization, thank you, processing plants, right? But he doesn't say, thank you, markets, because you can have all the technology in the world, but unless you've got a way to turn those inventions into innovations, you don't get books out of the washing machine without the market. Right. And Rosling, because he's not a classical liberal, right? He's awesome, but he's not a classical liberal. That's the missing piece. And
it's also in the video on the 200 countries, right? 200 years in four
right.
minutes. Yeah.
And let's go back to Lavoie for a second, right? Because one of the things about Don is, and I think I said this in my eulogy of Don, which is, and we both have this, and I think, and our Don students certainly do, the rest of them do, which is Don never attributed ill will or bad faith to his intellectual opponents. In fact, he might have gone too far the other way sometimes.
Yeah,
but the point was, it was like Don's mental space was, look, if I could only talk with them, if I could only sit down and have a conversation with them, we'd find some way to get someplace, right? And I think you and I and Don's students shared that mentality. And that's like I'm sitting here telling you this story. I'm thinking, damn it, I wish I had an hour with Rosling. I just want an hour with him, right? Where we can talk about this. And will I persuade him? I might, right? But I might not. But okay, I'd learn something. But that's it. I don't want to beat him over the head. I don't want to call him a back. I want an hour with him to talk to him.
I'm laughing because my colleagues had to defend me from this, which was, so I got sent the page proofs of the McLean book, as you know.
Yeah.
And I was supposed to write a big thing for the Wall Street Journal or whatever for him. And then I wrote a 40-page review. Right. And so that's not going to go.
There's value in pithiness.
Yeah. And then I realized that I'm like the poster child of everything that, but before all the McLean stuff started to hit, my original reaction was, I need to send her an email and say, hey, could we sit and talk about this? Because I think, like this. And everyone's like, the book's about ready to go to press. Oprah's making it a summer book of the year award. She's not going to want to listen to you. That's not the purpose of what she's doing. I'm like, no one would just write a book to be able to not have a conversation with the people that they want to debate with. And that's from the voice.
It is. We're not hopelessly naive.
Because my undergraduate teacher, I went to Grove City College, and I love it every single day. But my undergraduate teacher, who inspired me so much, but he, like a lot of people within the Austrian circle, would have attribute, the fact that the opponents are out to undermine you on purpose, and they're not there to have a honest conversation. They're there to try to trip you up, so don't trust them.
Yeah, and I had an undergraduate role model who was much more like Don, and that was another Don, the two Dons of my life, Don Herzog, right? Who disagreed with, now I can say who disagreed with me. Back then I would
show you how much Don would bend over backwards. In my dissertation, as you know, which was on the Soviet thing, there's two things that are going on during the period of time that I'm writing in Soviet history, which is they're actually changing the history.
Yeah.
So Stalin rewrites the history of the previous, programs of the central party, politics, and people who were studying it on the outside were rewriting the history to fit with either Stalin or not, depending on where they're at. And so I came across some very obvious sketchiness on the part of people like Maurice Daub and some other people like that. And I said, Don, what am I supposed to do when I'm wrestling with these ideas and they're shifting around on all these things like that? And he said to me, without even blinking an eye, he says, you pick the one that's most charitable to their position and the one that's hardest for you to argue against. And he goes, go back and do that.
Right. What we today we call steel manning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
And so Don was adamant about doing that and then demanding. So I understand where you have.
We got 15 minutes or so.
Let me ask you.
Just don't forget to ask me your bonus question.
I'm gonna ask you the last two questions, I guess. Let me ask you the three. So first, if you could go back in time and visit with professors in the early 1980s when you were in graduate school, knowing what you know now, and put Lavoie off the table, but any of them. Say Buchanan was there, Tulloch was there, Boulding was there, Karen Vaughan was there, Victor Vanberg, Tullison even, or whatever, any of them. What would you ask today that you didn't get a chance to ask then?
I don't know. I when I read that question, I was thinking, I'm not sure what I would go back and ask them today. Maybe to go back to something I said earlier, how did you keep reinventing yourself in a way that kept you focused on the scientific conversation? And I think I know the answer. I think the answer is grad students. I think they keep you intellectually young. You have to, right? I think if you have PhD students, you can't work with them unless you're at the edge of whatever's happening and therefore wanting to make those contributions. And it is, I'm going to detour from your question for a second. I've never had PhD students, only by adoption, the times that I've been to Mercatus and worked with those guys, some great ones, and I'm working with a great one right now. And I'm grateful for that opportunity that you and Mercatus have given me. And so I've never had that. I don't have it at Ball State. And I love working with undergraduates, and that's clearly my comparative advantage, and that's fine. But the cost of that, I think, is just what we're talking about, and is how do you stay engaged in the discipline? One of the interesting things about the move to Ball State was it has forced me to be more so because my colleagues I have more research-oriented colleagues than I did at St. Lawrence, and that's been good. And I do have an article under review at the Journal of Economic History right now. I co-authored one. We'll see what happens. That thing's got to get published somewhere. It's too good. But it's just keeping. How do you keep up with that? And I think that's the question I would have asked.
We were fortunate. I mean, you did have someone like Bolding, for example, who was like what you said before is challenged and curious. Yeah. And he just always seemed, and also urgency of it all.
Yeah. So right. And I was just telling someone, maybe was it Sarah I was telling this? I know we were talking about this. I got to tell this story. It's kind of not, the urgency made me think of it. The other little role model for me is, in this way, is Kerzner. You and I sat at FEE for a decade or so and watched him walk in every year and deliver essentially the same lecture. That's that introductory lecture, essentially the same lecture every year, except it was never the same twice. Right. It was always a little different. There was a new analogy. There was a new this. There was new that. And you could just see him going back afterwards going, you know what? I didn't get that as well. It wasn't right. It wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. There's a better Kerzner I can be, right? This is right. There's a better Kerzner I can be. And at age 80, delivering it like it was the most important damn thing in the world, right? And he's given that talk 50 gazillion times. I'm like, damn it.
When I worked with him at NYU, he would be in his office and he taught a course for undergraduates. Yeah. And he had a sign that went up on the wall and it said, if this door is closed and you hear Professor Kerzner inside, do not knock. He doesn't want to be disturbed. And he would put that up an hour before every time he went to go lecture. And it was amazing because he would, be so dedicated to a course he'd been teaching for 20 years, Yeah. And so it's pretty phenomenal. It's interesting that you mentioned what you said, because when I was a youngster, I had the opportunity to meet Robert Nozick. And I asked Nozick, how do you keep yourself fresh? And he says, never teach the same class twice. Yeah. Yeah,
I get that. But go back to my discussion earlier. I think if you teach the same class multiple times, you end up using it as a way to stimulate a kind of deeper engagement. I think if Nozick was teaching grad students, right, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think that's how Buchanan did it. Yeah, Wagner does it. They teach their papers. But anyway, I do think there's also, you're onto something, because I think you can look and study certain colleagues who, when they are brought into an environment where there all of a sudden is a bunch of students around, all of a sudden their productivity goes up too. Yeah. Yeah. And it's not because the students are running regressions. It's because the interaction of the ideas.
Right. That's why, I mean, if I think back to our time as grad students, right? I mean, we were like, here, I'll tell it as a kind of different story. I had a running joke with my friend Kathy when we used to teach together. We would go through something in class, whatever, and after class, we'd sit down and start sort of decompressing and talking about it. And she'd start laughing because, like, not every day, but frequently, at some point in that sort of postmortem conversation, I'd say, there's a paper in that, right? and that's the way, right? There's a paper in that. You could put that on my tombstone too, but there's a paper in that. And we were like that in grad school, right? We were like,
we were taught to be that way too. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And sort of I know that you've talked about this with grad students, and I have too, which is getting them, and this is in Jason Brennan's stuff too, is getting them out of the mindset of writing papers for class. Right. When you write papers in class, you're writing it potentially for the journals. Everything you write should be, there's a paper in that, let's write it. Even I had a conversation, I want to say too much. I had a conversation with a colleague yesterday or the day before in a different discipline who had an idea for a paper that I think is so good. And I said to her, has anyone done this before? And she said, no. And I said, have you talked to people in this discipline? And she said, yeah, I talked to so-and-so and so-and-so. And they said, no one's ever done this before. And I said to her, oh my God, I said, you have to get off Zoom with me right now and write this paper, like right before someone comes, steals it or thinks of it, right? Because this is so good. You need to, and that level of excitement, right? I mean, I was feeling it sort of for her, but it's like, yeah, that's the thing, right? How do you, when you're with other people, you get that, right? When you're in those conversations with grad students and others. I get it with my colleagues here too.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, and we have, you have been very important part throughout your career of your interactions with Mercatus, both as a research scholar and then also in providing teaching and getting to know some of the graduate students and mentoring them and working with them. And I miss those workshops Emily and I did. I mean, I understand why they're not the right solution now for a variety of reasons. And I couldn't be happier that Emily's in the job she's in. But yeah, I miss that. I love that stuff. I miss it. So I wanted to end by asking you two questions. And just my question will be very easy, which is just, if you could, you wrote your dissertation with Don. We, as students of Don, tend to emphasize Don. We had, very good professors across the board at the time. But what other professors at Mason besides Don, or what aspects of Don have you continued on, or what other people have influenced you greatly?
Well, I think we've talked about the ways in which, Don lives in all of us, right? I would say just about Don, the kind of the six-tool player thing, right? I notice I snuck that sixth in there. That's the administrative stuff. But sort of the kind of variety of things and working in the liberal arts college and sort of my desire to communicate with the left and all those things are all Don. That's Don living in me in ways, frankly, I didn't really think about too consciously until Don got sick. But I want to talk about someone else. And we're both, but I'm a big Karen Vaughn fan.
Right.
And I think that Karen's role in all of this early history we're talking about, still is not appreciated. Right. I mean, Karen had that fifth tool, right? She was an institution builder. She was an entrepreneur in those ways. She had the connections in the discipline. And I think a great deal of what that program is there now owes a lot to Karen's work early on. And I don't think that's appreciated. Karen was also, by the way, in addition to all those things, was a terrific mentor of grad students. If you were doing history of economic thought, right, you had a top flight historian of economic thought at your disposal. But just, when she was department chair, when I was a young teacher, right, the ability to walk into Karen's office and talk about teaching stuff and all that. Yeah. And so I think
think about how important it is that a woman was the one carrying, time was carrying the water of that department in this university.
Oh, and with some of her male colleagues who will remain nameless, who didn't always work so well.
Well, and they also created problems externally because of who they are, but she was there to do all that.
Yep.
She's amazing. She had an innovation that started with me and then unfortunately ended with you because she stopped being chairman, was she made us assistant professors our final year in graduate school.
Indeed.
And that experience, again, like you said about something earlier or whatever, it was kind of all of a sudden, it was like you got invited in and she said, I would like to make you an assistant professor. And at the time, remember, we think this department's the greatest department in the world. And you're like, really? Like me? Like then she's like, and you're going to teach 12 hours.
Yeah. Well, there was that part. Yeah. I got to say, I don't know. I look back, I know what the answer is. I look back and I go, I was teaching a freaking 4-4 load with new preps and writing a dissertation. How? Where? How did I do this? And you had a small child, you had a kid, right? Yeah. I'm like, well, one answer, my joke answer is, well, there were no committee meetings. So that
Yeah.
Right. Right. But, and no internet. Right. So that was, okay, that's, I have adult onset internet induced attention deficit disorder, but that's, but yeah, that's how we did it. There was no email.
Aaron was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
As a mentor, and also Victor Vanberg and others, and
it was amazing. It was an amazing place to be.
Yeah. Last question, Steve. It's a bonus question.
All right.
Which is, and you just go wherever you want with it. Which is, you've had a lot of changes and challenges in your life lately, but you're also one of the most optimistic and joyous warriors that I know. What keeps you marching forward and excites your intellectual imagination the most these days?
So I'm going to give my cute glib answer, though it's also not wrong. Me. I just heard my wife's eyes roll from 10 miles away at Liberty Fund. Shocking answer, Horwitz. But here's what I mean by that. I'm intellectually fascinated by this. I'm a living science experiment right now, and I'm intellectually fascinated by that. When I was going in for my first stem cell transplant, one of the doctors on the team was walking us through it, and he paused and he looked at me. He said, "You're an academic, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You probably find this really intellectually fascinating, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, I do." Right. And so for me, it's bizarre. I think it's bizarre to someone who hasn't not going through it, but it's like, okay. So we have to do these things. I mean, I feel great. I'm cancer free right now. I feel great. Right. You're
like the character in The Martian.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, let's solve the problem. Yeah.
Right. Right. But I'm like, I feel great right now. And how is that? Well, the science is fascinating. The medicine's fascinating. I'm on, 2 stem cell transplants. I'm on these 2 medications right now that are keeping the cancer at bay. It's amazing. And that's part of the Julian Simon stuff too, right? I mean, Jason Kuznicki from Cato said to me early on, he said, the way that treatment of multiple myeloma has progressed, he said, you will be living tribute to all the ideas you've been arguing for all these years. And I haven't forgotten that, right? So to me, fascinating. Also, I can't lie, right? So last February, I was in the hospital and I, for related stuff, and I bent over and my heart went tachycardic. My heart was like 120 per minute or something, right? Really high, and wouldn't stop. And the beat was off. So they have to do something about it. Long story short, they gave me an infusion that rebooted my heart, basically stopped my heart for a second and started it again, right? And it didn't work the first time. I had to do it a second time, which also didn't work. And then they gave me a different drug. So twice I went through this. Sarah's petrified, right? I'm like, well, now we're going to know what it feels like if your heart stopped and started again. I'm just like, I'm fascinated by this. I can't explain why I should have been petrified. I kind of was, but I'm just like, oh, well, and I'm also fascinated by the social end of this, which is how the relationship between patients and doctors. So I can't not be a social scientist, right? I'm fascinated by how people deal with you when you have an illness like this. I'm fascinated about how I and others deal with death. I'm just all of that stuff. It will surprise no one for me to say that I'm the most fascinating thing in my life right now. Right. But I mean that. I mean, I mean it also as a social scientist, right? It's really, really interesting for me to experience as an economist, to experience the sort of medical system from the inside. I have a potential project actually with Mercatus that might deal with this. So we'll leave that aside. But so that's one. But the second, what keeps me going is that's why the Simon Award was so well-timed and important to me. I mean, that work and thinking about those issues and thinking about the long climb humanity's made out of poverty and misery and war, to me is that continues to enthrall me, and I want to keep talking about it, and I want to keep the talk in Greece in particular. I want to keep talking about this idea of economics as social cooperation. You know, the story that Mises would have titled Human Action Social I wish he would have. We would have had a really different world had he, but I understand why he didn't. But I want to keep talking about that. One of my proudest moments at St. Lawrence was when I persuaded the head of our peace studies program to allow Econ 101 to count as an elective in our peace studies program. And I'm like, yes, that's where the dialogue should begin, right? This is Hayek dedicating to socialists of all parties. He meant it. He wasn't being sarcastic. He meant it, right? And so I think for me, again, if we could only talk, the people who call themselves progressives, I want to talk about progress, and I want to talk about the sources of progress, and I want to talk about what an amazing place we live in. And the last few years of my life, particularly the illness, has forced me to confront and appreciate all of that. It's personal now. Before it was just, it was a game. Yeah, it was fun and it was important, but it was still a game. Now it's personal. I live weirdly month to month, right? Next month I go and get more labs and we'll see what that has to say and we'll go from there. Who knows what I got left, but whatever it is, that's the kind of combination of things right now. It's dealing how to, I'm fascinating to me, but I'm fascinating to me because it's part of this bigger story about progress and all these things.
Yeah. Well, first, it's wonderful to see you so healthy and
let's
spry.
keep it going.
And let's keep that going. And as Jason said, let's make sure the scientific innovations continue
and I will just as a quick pause that, the amazing thing is even like I was really sick. One of the nurses said to me, when I came in looking healthy, she goes, you weren't looking so good earlier this year. You were kind of translucent. Okay. That's not good. And I'm feeling so much better. And in that, even in that 9 months or whatever, there's at least one, maybe two new drugs that have been approved, right? Every time a new drug gets approved, I have one more, as it were, bullet in the chamber, one more thing to use to fight this thing. And so the longer as you say, the longer I keep stretching it out, and there's a cure on the horizon. I don't know if I'll get there, but it's there.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Steve. This has been wonderful to have this
My
conversation
pleasure.
with you and to reminisce, but also for the promise of all the great things to come. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Pete, as always. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.